My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "Patricia, you smell like old people. It's embarrassing when we go out together." I smiled sweetly and replied, "Don't worry, dear. By next week, you'll be smelling like unemployment." What she didn't know was that I had connections she never imagined, and her little comment was about to cost her everything she'd worked for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Patricia Kellerman, 58 years old, and I've spent the last 3 decades building a successful career in pharmaceutical sales management. When people meet me, they see a well-dressed woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, someone who commands respect in boardrooms and has earned every promotion through sheer determination. What they don't see is the network I've cultivated over 30 years, the relationships I've built across industries, and the quiet influence I wield in professional circles throughout the city. My son Marcus has always been the light of my life. At 32, he's a brilliant software engineer with a kind heart and, unfortunately, terrible judgment when it comes to women. 3 years ago, he brought home Vanessa Sterling, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator at a mid-tier advertising agency. She was beautiful in that Instagram-perfect way, with cascading auburn waves, expertly applied makeup, and a wardrobe that suggested she spent far more on clothes than her salary should allow. From the beginning, something about Vanessa rubbed me wrong. She had this way of inserting herself into conversations, always steering them back to her own accomplishments or complaints. During family dinners, she'd monopolize Marcus's attention, touching his arm possessively whenever I tried to speak with him. She treated service staff with casual dismissal and had an opinion about everything, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged. But Marcus was smitten. He'd light up whenever she entered a room, hanging on her every word like she was dispensing profound wisdom instead of shallow observations about reality television and social media trends. When they announced their engagement last Christmas, I bit my tongue and smiled, hoping that marriage might settle her into something resembling maturity. The incident that changed everything happened on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. Marcus and Vanessa had invited me to lunch at Riverside Bistro, an upscale restaurant downtown where we'd planned to discuss wedding preparations. I'd taken extra care with my appearance that morning, wearing my favorite navy blazer and the pearls my late husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. I'd even stopped by the salon earlier in the week for a fresh cut and color touch-up. We were seated at a lovely table overlooking the river, the spring sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I'd been having a wonderful conversation with Marcus about his latest project at work when Vanessa excused herself to use the restroom. She was gone for nearly 15 minutes, and when she returned, her mood had shifted completely. She slid back into her chair with a forced smile, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "Sorry about that," she said, not meeting my eyes. "I ran into my colleague Rachel. She was here with her mother-in-law." "How nice," I replied, sensing undercurrents I couldn't quite identify. It's always pleasant to see familiar faces when you're out. Vanessa picked at her salad, her fork making sharp clicking sounds against the porcelain. "Yes, well, Rachel mentioned something interesting." She finally looked up at me, her green eyes cold. "She said you smell like old people, like mothballs and medicinal cream and that musty scent that clings to everything in nursing homes." The words hit me like a physical slap. Marcus nearly choked on his wine, his face flushing red. "Vanessa, that's completely inappropriate." "I'm just being honest," she continued, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "Patricia, you smell like old people. It's embarrassing when we go out together. People notice these things." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter around us, or perhaps my hearing had narrowed to focus entirely on her words. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but years of corporate negotiations had taught me to maintain composure under pressure. I set down my napkin carefully and looked directly at her. "Don't worry, dear," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "By next week, you'll be smelling like unemployment." Vanessa laughed, a sharp sound that drew glances from nearby tables. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Marcus, I think I'll head home. Thank you for lunch." I kissed my son's cheek, noting the confusion and hurt in his eyes. We'll talk soon. As I walked through the restaurant, my spine straight and my head high, I heard Vanessa's voice behind me. She's so dramatic. Honestly, Marcus, your mother needs to learn to take constructive criticism. I didn't turn around. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing how deeply her words had cut. But as I reached my car in the parking lot, my hand shook as I inserted the key into the ignition. 30 years of professional success, countless presentations to corporate executives, board meetings where I'd held my own against men who tried to dismiss me, and this girl had managed to humiliate me in public with a few calculated words. But Vanessa made a critical error. She assumed that because I was older, because I was Marcus's mother, I was powerless. She underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. That evening, I sat in my home office, a converted bedroom that overlooked my carefully tended garden. The walls were lined with awards, professional certifications, and photographs from industry conferences spanning 3 decades. My Rolodex, both physical and digital, contained contacts across multiple industries: pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, advertising agencies, tech firms, healthcare networks, and consulting groups. I'd placed former colleagues in positions of influence, mentored young professionals who now held director-level positions, and maintained relationships with decision-makers across the city. I pulled out my laptop and began making a list. Vanessa worked at Meridian Creative, a mid-size advertising agency that specialized in healthcare marketing. I knew the company well, not just by reputation, but because I'd done business with them for years. 3 of their major accounts were pharmaceutical companies I'd worked with directly or had strong relationships with. Their biggest account, Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, was a company where I'd spent 5 years early in my career before moving to a competitor. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom, I'm so sorry about lunch. Vanessa feels terrible about what she said. She didn't mean it the way it came out."
I stared at the message for a long moment. Marcus, sweet Marcus, always trying to smooth over his girlfriend's sharp edges, always making excuses for behavior that needed no interpretation. Vanessa had meant exactly what she'd said, delivered with the precision of someone who knew how to wound. I typed back, "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. These things happen. How is work going?" It was easier to deflect than to explain what I was planning. Marcus would try to talk me out of it, would appeal to my better nature, would remind me that holding grudges wasn't healthy. But this wasn't about holding a grudge. This was about consequences. The next morning, I made my first call. Jennifer Walsh had been my assistant at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals 15 years ago, fresh out of college with a business degree and unlimited ambition. I'd mentored her, helped her navigate corporate politics, and watched with pride as she climbed the ladder. She was now Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. "Patricia!" Jennifer's voice was warm with genuine affection. "What a wonderful surprise! How are you?" "I'm well, dear, and you? How's the family?" We spent several minutes catching up on personal news before I shifted the conversation to business. "Jennifer, I wanted to ask about your relationship with Meridian Creative. I believe they handle some of your marketing campaigns." "They do. They're our primary agency for the consumer education initiatives. Why do you ask?" "I've been hearing some concerning things about their account management practices. Nothing concrete, just whispers about unprofessional behavior and potential conflicts of interest. I thought you should be aware, given how important brand reputation is in our industry." Jennifer's tone became more serious. "What kind of unprofessional behavior?" "I'd rather not spread unsubstantiated rumors, but I know how carefully Pinnacle manages its public image. You might want to take a closer look at who's representing your brand in public settings. I've heard about some rather embarrassing incidents at industry events." It wasn't entirely untrue. Vanessa's behavior at lunch could certainly be considered unprofessional, and her tendency to dominate conversations at social gatherings was well documented. I was simply encouraging Jennifer to pay closer attention to something she should have been monitoring anyway. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," Jennifer said. "We're actually due for a quarterly review with Meridian next month. I'll make sure to include some specific questions about their team's public conduct." After we hung up, I made similar calls to contacts at two other companies that worked with Meridian Creative. Each conversation was carefully crafted, raising concerns without making specific accusations, encouraging closer scrutiny without demanding immediate action. I was planting seeds, not wielding a sledgehammer. By Wednesday, I'd learned that Meridian Creative was facing budget pressures. A former colleague who now worked in business development at a competing agency mentioned that Meridian had lost two smaller accounts in the past quarter and was heavily dependent on their pharmaceutical clients for revenue stability. Thursday morning, I attended a healthcare marketing conference downtown, an event I'd been planning to attend anyway. These quarterly gatherings brought together professionals from across the industry, and I'd been a regular attendee for over a decade. What Vanessa didn't know was that her boss, Meridian Creative's creative director Robert Chen, would also be there. I'd met Robert several times over the years at similar events. He was a competent professional, though somewhat anxious about maintaining client relationships in an increasingly competitive market. I found him during the networking lunch, standing near the dessert table with a plate of untouched food, checking his phone with a worried expression. "Robert," I said, approaching with a warm smile, "how lovely to see you again." "Patricia, hello!" He looked genuinely pleased to see a familiar face. "How are things in the pharmaceutical world?" "Busy as always. I've been working with several companies on their marketing strategies lately." This was true. I did consulting work for various firms. Speaking of which, I wanted to mention something. I've been hearing excellent things about Meridian's work lately. Robert's face brightened considerably. "That's wonderful to hear. We've been working hard to expand our healthcare portfolio." "Yes, I can see that. Though I have to say, I've also been hearing some concerns about account management practices in the industry generally. Nothing specific to Meridian, of course, but clients are becoming increasingly sensitive about how their brands are represented in public settings." His expression grew more serious. "What kind of concerns?" "Professional conduct, mainly. Clients want to ensure that everyone associated with their brand maintains the highest standards of behavior, even in informal settings. You know how our industry is. Any hint of unprofessional conduct can damage years of relationship building." Robert nodded gravely. "Absolutely. We make sure all our team members understand the importance of professional representation." "I'm sure you do. It's just that in such a competitive market, clients are paying closer attention to these details. I know Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, for instance, has been conducting more thorough reviews of their agency partners lately. This was technically accurate, based on my conversation with Jennifer, though I was perhaps overstating the extent of their scrutiny." Robert's face paled slightly at the mention of his biggest client. "I wasn't aware of any specific concerns," he said carefully. "Oh, I'm sure there aren't any significant issues. It's more about proactive management, staying ahead of potential problems. You know how quickly things can escalate in our industry if there's even the perception of unprofessional behavior." We were interrupted by another conference attendee, ending our conversation on that note of vague concern. I could see Robert's mind working, already planning damage control measures for problems he wasn't even sure existed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Friday afternoon, Marcus called me at work. "Mom, can we have dinner tonight? Vanessa's working late on some big project." "Of course, sweetheart, in her usual place." We met at DeMarco's, the Italian restaurant where we'd been having mother-son dinners since his college days. Marcus looked tired, stress lines visible around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Everything all right at work?" I asked after we'd ordered. "Yeah, work's fine. It's just—" He hesitated, pushing his breadstick around his plate. "Vanessa's been really stressed lately. Something's going on at her job, but she won't talk about it. She's been coming home upset every night this week." I made appropriately sympathetic sounds while internally noting the timeline. It had been exactly 1 week since our disastrous lunch. "Has she mentioned what kind of stress?" I asked carefully. "Something about increased scrutiny from clients, additional review processes, extra documentation requirements. She thinks someone has been spreading rumors about the agency, but she won't say what kind of rumors." "That sounds frustrating for her," I said, and meant it. Workplace stress was genuinely difficult, even when it was deserved. Sometimes these industry cycles happen. Clients get nervous about market conditions and start demanding more oversight. Marcus nodded, but he still looked troubled. Mom, I know things have been tense between you and Vanessa lately. Is there anything I should know about? This was the moment I'd been dreading. My son's earnest face, his obvious concern for the woman he loved, the trust in his eyes that I would tell him the truth, and I would tell him the truth, just not all of it. Marcus, I won't pretend that Vanessa and I always see eye to eye. We're very different people from different generations. But I would never do anything to deliberately harm her career or your relationship. This was technically accurate. I wasn't deliberately harming her career. I was simply ensuring that her behavior had appropriate consequences. And I certainly wasn't trying to harm Marcus. Quite the opposite. I know you wouldn't, he said, relief evident in his voice. I just worry sometimes that she feels like you don't approve of her. My approval isn't what matters, sweetheart. What matters is that she makes you happy and treats you well. I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. And that she treats others with respect and kindness. Marcus smiled, the tension leaving his shoulders. She does make me happy, Mom. I know she can be a little sharp sometimes, but she's ambitious and driven. She wants to succeed. I can see that, I said. Success is important, but so is character. We spent the rest of dinner talking about his work, mutual friends, and his plans for the weekend. I didn't mention that I'd spent the week systematically undermining his fiancé's professional reputation. I didn't tell him about the calls I'd made, the seeds of doubt I'd planted, or the additional steps I was planning to take. Because the truth was, I was just getting started. Monday morning brought the first visible results of my campaign. Marcus called me during my lunch break, his voice tight with concern. Mom, I need to talk to someone. Vanessa had a terrible day at work. Her boss called her into his office for what she thought was a routine check-in, but it turned into an interrogation about her professional conduct. I set down my sandwich and gave him my full attention. What kind of questions? Apparently, there have been complaints about her behavior at client events, something about inappropriate comments and unprofessional conduct, but Vanessa swears she hasn't done anything wrong. She thinks someone at the office is trying to sabotage her. That sounds very stressful, I said, which was genuine. Being questioned about your professional conduct was never pleasant, even when the questions were justified. Did her boss give her any specific examples? That's the thing. Everything was vague. References to concerning reports and client feedback, but no concrete incidents. Vanessa's convinced that someone has it out for her, but she can't figure out who or why. I made sympathetic noises while considering my next move. The investigation was proceeding exactly as I anticipated. Robert Chen was doing his due diligence, following up on the concerns I'd raised, but finding the same thing I had found when I started looking into Vanessa's background. A pattern of behavior that was problematic but not illegal, unprofessional but not actionable. Has she considered talking to HR? I suggested. If someone is deliberately spreading false information about her, the company should investigate. She's afraid that involving HR will make her look weak or paranoid. You know how competitive her industry is. I did know. I also knew that Vanessa's reluctance to involve HR had nothing to do with appearing weak and everything to do with her understanding that closer scrutiny of her conduct wouldn't work in her favor. Maybe she should document everything, I suggested. Keep records of her interactions, her work product, client communications. That way, if there are formal complaints, she'll have evidence to support her version of events. This was actually good advice, though I suspected that if Vanessa followed it, the documentation would only confirm what I already knew about her character.
Tuesday, I made another strategic move.
I'd learned through my network that Meridian Creative was pitching for a new account with Blackstone Medical, a medical device company where I'd done consulting work the previous year. The company's marketing director, David Kim, was someone I'd worked closely with on a product launch campaign. I called David under the pretext of catching up on industry news. During our conversation, I mentioned that I'd heard Meridian Creative was in the running for their new account. "They're one of the finalists," David confirmed. "Their creative work is strong, but we're doing extensive vetting of all the agencies. After that disaster with our previous agency, we can't afford another public relations nightmare." "What happened with your previous agency?" I asked, though I already knew the story. Their former marketing partner had made some tone-deaf social media posts that had created negative publicity for Blackstone. Unprofessional social media presence, inappropriate comments at industry events, just a general lack of awareness about how their behavior reflected on our brand. It cost us months of relationship repair with key stakeholders. "That's exactly the kind of thing clients are worried about these days," I agreed. "Due diligence on agency personnel is just as important as reviewing their creative capabilities." "Absolutely. We're actually conducting background checks and reference calls for all the key team members who would be working on our account. Can't be too careful in this climate." After we hung up, I realized I didn't need to do anything more with Blackstone Medical. If they were conducting thorough background checks on Meridian's team members, they would discover what I'd discovered, that Vanessa had a history of unprofessional conduct that posed a reputational risk. Wednesday brought the second wave of consequences. Marcus showed up at my office without calling first, something he hadn't done since college. My assistant buzzed me to say he was in the lobby, and I could tell from her tone that something was wrong. I found him pacing in the reception area, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "Can we talk privately?" he asked, glancing around at the busy lobby. I led him to my office and closed the door. He sank into the chair across from my desk, burying his face in his hands. "Vanessa's been suspended," he said, without preamble. I sat down carefully, keeping my expression neutral. "Suspended? What happened?" "Her boss received a formal complaint from one of their major clients, something about unprofessional conduct and concerns about brand representation. The client specifically requested that Vanessa be removed from their account." "Which client?" I asked, though I already knew. "Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. Apparently, they've been conducting a review of all their agency partners, and something came up about Vanessa's behavior at public events. Her boss is treating it like a major crisis." I felt a mixture of satisfaction and genuine sympathy for my son's distress. "Has Vanessa been given a chance to respond to the complaint?" "That's just it. The complaint was so vague that she doesn't even know what she's supposed to have done. References to inappropriate comments and unprofessional demeanor, but no specific incidents or dates. It's like someone decided she was a problem and worked backward to find reasons." Marcus looked up at me with haunted eyes. "Mom, I know you said you'd never deliberately harm Vanessa's career, but I have to ask, do you know anything about this?" The question hung in the air between us. I could see the conflict in his face, his love for both Vanessa and me, warring with his growing suspicion that these events weren't coincidental. "Marcus," I said carefully, "you know me well enough to know that I don't make accusations lightly or spread unfounded rumors. If someone is raising concerns about Vanessa's professional conduct, perhaps the question isn't who's raising them, but whether they're valid. What's that supposed to mean? It means that sometimes people face consequences for their choices and their behavior. If multiple clients are expressing concerns about someone's professionalism, maybe the problem isn't the clients." Marcus stared at me for a long moment. "You're saying she brought this on herself?" "I'm saying that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences take time to manifest. If Vanessa is facing professional difficulties, maybe she should examine her own conduct rather than looking for someone to blame." "But you didn't answer my question," he pressed. "Do you know anything about this?" I leaned back in my chair, considering my words carefully. "Marcus, I've spent 30 years in this industry. I know people, I hear things, I have conversations. If someone asks me about professional standards or industry practices, I share my knowledge and experience. I don't manufacture problems, but I also don't ignore them when I see them. It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't an admission either. Marcus was intelligent enough to read between the lines, but he was also in love, which complicated his ability to see clearly. "She's talking about leaving the industry entirely," he said quietly. "She says the whole thing is rigged against her, that there's some kind of old boys network that she'll never be able to break into." "Perhaps that would be for the best," I said gently. "Not every career path is right for every person. Sometimes a major setback is an opportunity to reevaluate and find something better suited to your temperament and skills." Marcus stood up abruptly. "I can't believe you just said that." "Said what?" "That it would be for the best if Vanessa's career was destroyed. Do you understand that this affects me too? That I love her and want her to be happy and successful?" I stood as well, moving around my desk to face him directly. "Marcus, I want you to be happy more than anything in the world, but I also want you to be with someone who treats people with kindness and respect, someone who builds you up instead of tearing others down, someone who would never deliberately humiliate you or the people you love." "What are you talking about?" "Last week at lunch, Vanessa looked me in the eye and told me I smell like old people, in front of you, in a crowded restaurant, deliberately designed to embarrass and hurt me. Is that the kind of behavior you want to defend?" Marcus's face flushed red.
She apologized for that. She said it came out wrong. No, Marcus, she laughed when I said she'd smell like unemployment. She didn't apologize until later, and only because you were upset. The cruelty was intentional. We stared at each other across my office, 32 years of love and trust tested by this moment of honesty. "So you did do this," he said finally. "You destroyed her career because of one comment." "I didn't destroy anything," I said firmly. "I simply made sure that the people who needed to know about her character had the information they needed to make informed decisions. If her career is suffering, it's because her behavior finally caught up with her." Marcus shook his head, backing toward the door. "I thought I knew you, Mom. I thought you were better than this. I am exactly who I've always been, sweetheart. Someone who protects the people she loves and doesn't tolerate cruelty from anyone, regardless of their relationship to this family." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded final. I sat back down at my desk and stared out the window at the city beyond. I'd known this moment would come, known that Marcus would eventually piece together what I'd done. I'd hoped it would happen after Vanessa was completely out of the picture, when he could see clearly how much better his life was without her manipulation and cruelty. But life rarely followed the timeline we preferred. Thursday morning brought news that accelerated everything. Jennifer Walsh called me from Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals, her voice tight with professional anger. "Patricia, I wanted to thank you for the heads up about Meridian Creative. We completed our review, and what we found was deeply concerning." "Oh," I kept my voice neutral, though my pulse quickened. "Multiple instances of unprofessional conduct from their account coordinator, inappropriate comments at client events, dismissive treatment of service staff, and what appears to be a pattern of creating conflict within professional settings. We're terminating our contract with them immediately." I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of what I'd set in motion. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jennifer. I know how much time and effort goes into building these partnerships. What's worse is that we've learned this individual is engaged to the son of another industry professional. The whole situation creates potential conflicts of interest that we can't ignore." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? If family relationships within the industry aren't properly disclosed, it raises questions about objectivity and professional independence. We can't have our marketing campaigns managed by someone whose personal relationships might influence their professional judgment." This was a development I hadn't anticipated. Jennifer was right that industry relationships should be disclosed, but the connection between Vanessa and me was distant and hadn't influenced any business decisions. Yet, I could see how it might appear problematic from the outside. "Jennifer, I hope you know that my conversation with you about professional standards was entirely separate from any personal considerations. Of course, Patricia, your integrity has never been in question, but the appearance of these interconnected relationships is exactly the kind of thing that creates regulatory concerns." After we hung up, I sat in my office trying to process the implications. I'd intended to create professional consequences for Vanessa's personal cruelty, but I'd inadvertently created a much larger crisis that could affect multiple careers and companies. My phone rang almost immediately. Robert Chen from Meridian Creative, his voice strained and barely controlled.
Patricia, I need to speak with you urgently about one of my employees. Of course, Robert, how can I help? Vanessa Sterling, I understand she's involved with your son? The directness of his approach caught me off guard. Yes, they're engaged. Why didn't you mention this when we spoke at the conference last week? I chose my words carefully. Our conversation was about general industry standards and professional conduct. I didn't see the relevance of personal relationships. The relevance, Robert said, his voice rising slightly, is that I've now lost my biggest client because of concerns you raised about professional standards, and it turns out you were talking about your future daughter-in-law the entire time. Robert, I never mentioned Vanessa's name in our conversation. I spoke only about general industry concerns and professional standards. But you knew exactly who you were targeting when you raised those concerns. I couldn't deny this because it was true. Robert, if Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals found legitimate concerns about their account management, then perhaps the problem isn't who raised the concerns, but whether they were valid. Valid or not, the way you handled this has destroyed my agency's relationship with our biggest client and thrown my entire team's job security into question. Did you consider that when you decided to pursue your personal vendetta? His words hit home because they contained enough truth to sting. I had pursued this as a personal matter, and I hadn't fully considered the collateral damage to innocent people at Meridian Creative who had nothing to do with Vanessa's behavior. Robert, I understand you're upset, and I'm sorry that your team is facing job uncertainty. That was never my intention. Your intentions don't matter now, he said coldly. The damage is done. I hope your revenge was worth destroying the livelihoods of a dozen people who never did anything to you. After he hung up, I sat in my office feeling the full weight of what I had accomplished. Vanessa's career in healthcare marketing was almost certainly over. Her reputation in the industry would follow her to any similar position. But Robert was right about the collateral damage. Other people at Meridian Creative, people who had done nothing wrong, were now facing job uncertainty because of my actions. I had achieved exactly what I had set out to do, but the victory felt hollow and complicated by unintended consequences. Friday afternoon, Marcus came to my house. I found him sitting on my front porch when I returned from work, looking older than his 32 years. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I unlocked the door and led him into the living room where he had spent countless hours as a child, playing with toys on the same carpet where he now sat looking broken and lost.
Vanessa was fired this morning, he said without preamble. Effective immediately. They're citing professional conduct concerns and client relationship issues. I sat down across from him, saying nothing. She's devastated, Mom. Not just about the job, but about her entire career. Word spreads fast in her industry. No one else is going to hire her after something like this. I'm sorry she's going through this, I said, and meant it. Professional failure was painful, even when deserved. Are you? Marcus looked up at me with eyes that held more hurt than anger, because it seems like this is exactly what you wanted. What I wanted was for her to understand that actions have consequences. What I wanted was for someone who deliberately humiliated me to experience some humility herself. By destroying her entire career? By making sure she'll never work in marketing again? I considered this question seriously. Marcus, if Vanessa's career could be destroyed by people learning about her actual behavior, then maybe she was never qualified for that career in the first place. That's not the point, and you know it. His voice was quiet but intense. You used your network and your influence to systematically undermine someone who couldn't fight back. That's not justice. That's abuse of power. His words stung because they contained truth I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I had used my professional network for personal reasons. I had leveraged relationships built over decades to punish someone for a single moment of cruelty. You're right, I said quietly. I did use my influence in ways that weren't entirely appropriate. But Marcus, I also exposed real problems with her professional conduct that were affecting multiple clients and colleagues. Problems that might never have come to light if you hadn't gone looking for them with the specific intention of destroying her career. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything that had happened settling between us. I've been thinking about this all week, Marcus said finally, trying to understand how we got here, how the mother who taught me about fairness and compassion could do something so calculated and cruel. And what did you conclude? That you've been alone for too long. That losing Dad changed you in ways I didn't recognize until now. That maybe you've gotten so used to solving problems through professional manipulation that you've forgotten how to handle personal conflicts directly. His words cut deeper than any accusation of wrongdoing because they suggested that my actions reflected fundamental character flaws rather than temporary poor judgment. Maybe you're right, I admitted. Maybe I have gotten too comfortable wielding influence behind the scenes. But Marcus, that doesn't change the fact that Vanessa's behavior was genuinely problematic. Her behavior toward you was cruel, and I've told her that repeatedly, but she didn't deserve to have her entire career destroyed over one thoughtless comment. Wasn't one comment, sweetheart. It was a pattern of behavior that I witnessed and that other people in the industry had noticed as well. The comment to me was just the final example of how she treats people she considers beneath her. Marcus shook his head. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself that this was justified. I'm trying to help you understand that while my methods may have been questionable, the underlying concerns about her character were valid. Valid enough to end her career? Valid enough to potentially destroy my relationship with the woman I love? The question hung in the air between us. I thought about Vanessa's calculated cruelty at the restaurant, her dismissive treatment of service staff, her tendency to dominate conversations and redirect attention to herself. I thought about the pattern of behavior that had emerged when professionals started paying closer attention to her conduct. Yes, I said finally. I believe they were. Marcus stood up slowly, his face set in lines I'd never seen before. Then I guess we see the world very differently. Marcus, wait! I stood as well, reaching toward him. Don't let this destroy our relationship. Don't let her come between us even now. She's not coming between us, Mom. You did that when you decided that your hurt feelings were more important than professional ethics and basic decency. That's not what this was about, wasn't it? He turned to face me fully. You've spent 30 years building a network of professional relationships, and the moment someone hurt your feelings, you weaponized those relationships for personal revenge. How is that not exactly what this was about? I had no answer for him because he was right. Underneath all my rationalizations about professional standards and character concerns, I had acted out of wounded pride and personal vengeance. What happens now? I asked quietly. Now Vanessa and I are leaving. We're moving to Portland where she has some family and might be able to start over in a different industry. Somewhere far enough away that your influence can't reach her. The words hit me like physical blows. My son was leaving after everything I'd done to protect him, to expose the truth about Vanessa's character. He was choosing her over me and moving across the country to escape my influence. Marcus, please don't make any hasty decisions. Let's think this through rationally. I've been thinking about this all week, Mom, trying to understand how we got here, how the mother who taught me about fairness and compassion could do something so calculated and cruel. And what did you conclude? That you've been alone for too long, that losing Dad changed you in ways I didn't recognize until now, that maybe you've gotten so used to solving problems through professional manipulation that you've forgotten how to handle personal conflicts directly.
His words cut deeper than any accusation of wrongdoing because they suggested that my actions reflected fundamental character flaws rather than temporary poor judgment. Maybe you're right, I admitted. Maybe I have gotten too comfortable wielding influence behind the scenes. But Marcus, that doesn't change the fact that Vanessa's behavior was genuinely problematic. Her behavior toward you was cruel, and I've told her that repeatedly. But she didn't deserve to have her entire career destroyed over one thoughtless comment. It wasn't one comment, sweetheart. It was a pattern of behavior that I witnessed and that other people in the industry had noticed as well. The comment to me was just the final example of how she treats people she considers beneath her. Marcus shook his head. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself that this was justified. I'm trying to help you understand that while my methods may have been questionable, the underlying concerns about her character were valid.
Valid enough to end her career? Valid enough to potentially destroy my relationship with the woman I love? The question hung in the air between us. I thought about Vanessa's calculated cruelty at the restaurant, her dismissive treatment of service staff, her tendency to dominate conversations and redirect attention to herself. I thought about the pattern of behavior that had emerged when professionals started paying closer attention to her conduct. Yes, I said finally. I believe they were. Marcus stood up slowly, his face set in lines I'd never seen before. Then I guess we see the world very differently. Marcus, wait! I stood as well, reaching toward him. Don't let this destroy our relationship. Don't let her come between us even now. She's not coming between us, Mom. You did that when you decided that your hurt feelings were more important than professional ethics and basic decency. That's not what this was about. Wasn't it? He turned to face me fully. You've spent 30 years building a network of professional relationships, and the moment someone hurt your feelings, you weaponized those relationships for personal revenge. How was that not exactly what this was about? I had no answer for him, because he was right. Underneath all my rationalizations about professional standards and character concerns, I had acted out of wounded pride and personal vengeance. What happens now? I asked quietly. Now, Vanessa and I are leaving. We're moving to Portland, where she has some family and might be able to start over in a different industry, somewhere far enough away that your influence can't reach her. The words hit me like physical blows. My son was leaving. After everything I'd done to protect him, to expose the truth about Vanessa's character, he was choosing her over me and moving across the country to escape my influence. Marcus, please don't make any hasty decisions. Let's think this through rationally. I've been thinking about nothing else for days, Mom. This isn't hasty. This is necessary. His voice carried a finality that made my chest tighten with panic. But your job, your life here, your friends, you're going to throw all of that away for someone who treats people cruelly? I'm going to start over somewhere with the woman I love, away from family members who think personal vendettas are more important than basic human decency. After he left, I stood in my empty living room surrounded by 30 years of memories. Photos of Marcus at every stage of his life lined the mantelpiece. His first day of school, high school graduation, college commencement, the day he bought his first house. In every picture, he was smiling, his face open and trusting, looking at me with unconditional love. Now that love was conditional, and I had failed to meet the conditions. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my late husband's chair, the leather worn smooth by decades of evening conversations. David would have known what to do. He'd always been better at reading people, better at understanding the long-term consequences of short-term actions. He would have talked me out of this entire scheme before I'd made the first phone call. But David had been gone for 5 years, and I'd been making decisions alone for so long that I'd forgotten how to consider perspectives other than my own. My phone rang, startling me from my brooding. Margaret Santos, my former assistant from my early days at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, now a senior executive at a medical device company. Patricia, I heard about the situation with Meridian Creative. Are you all right? Word traveled fast in our industry. I shouldn't have been surprised that news of the agency's client losses and personnel changes had already made the rounds. I'm fine, Margaret. Thank you for asking. I have to say, I'm surprised by how this all unfolded. When you called me last month asking about professional standards and agency relationships, I had no idea you were dealing with a personal situation. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Well, everyone knows now that the account coordinator who was terminated is engaged to your son. The whole industry is buzzing about it. Some people are saying you used your network to target her specifically. Margaret, I hope you know that my professional standards and personal relationships are completely separate. Of course, Patricia. Your integrity has never been in question, but you know how people talk.
There are some who are saying this sets a dangerous precedent, using industry connections to settle personal scores. After we hung up, I realized that my actions had created consequences far beyond Vanessa's career destruction and Marcus's departure. My own professional reputation, carefully built over 3 decades, was now being questioned by colleagues who wondered whether my personal feelings had influenced my professional recommendations. The next morning brought a call from Jennifer Walsh at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. Her tone was noticeably cooler than it had been in our previous conversations. Patricia, I wanted to follow up on our discussion about Meridian Creative. Some additional information has come to light that I think you should be aware of. What kind of information? It's come to our attention that the individual we discussed is personally connected to you through family relationships. This creates some concerns about the context of our previous conversation. I gripped the phone tighter. Jennifer, my recommendations to you were based entirely on professional observations and industry standards. I'm sure they were, but the appearance of using business relationships to address personal conflicts is exactly the kind of thing that creates regulatory concerns for pharmaceutical companies. We can't be seen as participating in what might be construed as harassment or retaliation. I understand your concerns, but I want to assure you that my professional advice was given in good faith, based on legitimate industry standards. I believe that, Patricia, but given the circumstances, we're going to need to be more careful about how we handle information from industry contacts in the future. We can't risk any appearance of impropriety. The message was clear. My word, which had carried significant weight in pharmaceutical circles for decades, was now suspect. Future recommendations would be scrutinized more carefully, their validity questioned based on whether I might have personal motivations. I'd achieved my goal of destroying Vanessa's career, but I'd damaged my own reputation in the process. Tuesday brought an unexpected visitor. Robert Chen from Meridian Creative stood in my office lobby, his face haggard and his usually impeccable appearance disheveled. My assistant looked uncertain about whether to admit him. "It's all right, Sarah. Please send him up." Robert entered my office with the controlled anger of someone who'd spent days planning this confrontation. He sat down across from my desk without being invited and placed a folder between us. "I wanted you to see what your vendetta accomplished," he said without preamble, opening the folder to reveal termination letters and unemployment documents. "Robert, I understand you're upset about the situation with Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals." "Upset?" His voice rose slightly before he controlled it. "Patricia, I've had to lay off 6 people because of the client losses triggered by your campaign against Vanessa Sterling. 6 people with families and mortgages and children who depend on their paychecks." He pulled out photos from the folder, professional headshots of men and women I didn't recognize. "This is Maria Rodriguez, single mother of 2, worked for me for 4 years, excellent employee, never a complaint from any client. Terminated yesterday because we can't afford her salary without the Pinnacle account." He placed another photo on my desk. "This is James Mitchell, just bought his first house 6 months ago. His wife is pregnant with their first child, also terminated yesterday." One by one, he showed me the faces of people whose livelihoods had been destroyed by my actions. Each photo came with a story, personal details about mortgages and family obligations, and career plans that had been derailed by circumstances completely outside their control. "I want you to understand," Robert continued, his voice steady but intense, "that your personal revenge against one person has destroyed the financial security of 6 innocent families." I stared at the photos spread across my desk, each face representing consequences I hadn't considered when I'd started making phone calls. I'd been so focused on punishing Vanessa that I hadn't thought about the other people who worked at our company. "Robert, I never intended for innocent people to be harmed." "But you knew it was a possibility, didn't you? When you started making calls to our clients, raising concerns about professional standards, you knew that could affect the entire agency's relationship with those clients."
I had known that questioning Vanessa's conduct could damage Meridian Creative's client relationships. I'd simply chosen not to think about the broader implications. What can I do to help?
I asked quietly. Nothing. The damage is done. Pinnacle has already contracted with another agency. Blackstone Medical withdrew their consideration of us based on concerns about our personnel management practices. 2 other clients are conducting reviews of their relationships with us. Robert gathered the photos and documents, returning them to the folder. I came here because I wanted you to see the real cost of your revenge. Not just to Vanessa, but to everyone else whose lives you considered acceptable collateral damage. After he left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the city beyond my window. Somewhere out there, Maria Rodriguez was explaining to her children why Mommy had lost her job. James Mitchell was calculating whether they could still afford their mortgage payments. 4 other people were updating their resumes and wondering how they would explain their sudden unemployment to potential employers. I'd spent my career priding myself on my strategic thinking, my ability to anticipate consequences and plan for multiple contingencies. But in my personal vendetta against Vanessa, I'd acted with the kind of short-sighted focus that I would have criticized in any junior colleague. That evening, I called my brother Tom in Seattle. At 64, he was 2 years older than me and had always served as my sounding board for major decisions. I had avoided talking to him about the situation with Marcus and Vanessa because I'd known he would disapprove of my methods. "Patricia, you sound terrible. What's going on?" "I've made a mess of things, Tom. A really terrible mess." I told him everything. The lunch with Vanessa, her cruel comment about my smell, my systematic campaign to destroy her career, Marcus's decision to move to Portland, and the collateral damage to innocent people at Meridian Creative. Tom listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of concern or disapproval. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Patricia, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking that someone needed to face consequences for being deliberately cruel. I was thinking that she needed to learn that actions have repercussions. So you decided to play God with her life and career?" "I decided to make sure that people in the industry knew about her character and professional conduct. By leveraging relationships you'd built over 30 years for personal revenge? Patricia, that's not justice. That's abuse of power." His words echoed what Marcus had said, and hearing them from my brother, someone whose judgment I had always trusted, made them impossible to dismiss. "I know it wasn't handled perfectly, but Tom, you didn't hear what she said to me, the deliberate cruelty of it. So she said something mean to you. That gave you the right to destroy her career and the livelihoods of 6 other people? It wasn't just one mean comment, it was a pattern of behavior. A pattern you went looking for after she hurt your feelings. Patricia, you spent weeks investigating this woman like she was a criminal instead of just someone who said something unkind." Tom's voice softened slightly. "Sis, I understand that losing David left you feeling isolated and defensive. I understand that being alone for 5 years has made you hypersensitive to perceived slights. But this response was completely disproportionate to the offense. You think I'm having some kind of breakdown? I think you're a woman who's been alone too long and has forgotten how to handle personal conflicts without turning them into professional warfare. When was the last time you dealt with interpersonal problems as a private individual instead of as a corporate executive?" I thought about this question seriously. Since David's death, most of my social interactions had been professional. Industry conferences, business dinners, networking events. My personal relationships had atrophied, leaving me with primarily transactional connections based on mutual professional benefit. "I don't know," I admitted. "Patricia, you need to find a way to fix this, not just with Marcus, but with your own sense of who you are as a person versus who you are as a professional." "How do I fix something like this? I can't undo what I've done." "You start by taking responsibility for the full scope of the damage you've caused. You stop making excuses about Vanessa's character and admit that you used your professional influence to settle a personal score. And then you figure out how to make amends. Marcus won't even talk to me. He's moving to Portland to get away from my influence. Then maybe you need to let him go.
Maybe the best thing you can do for your son right now is prove that you understand what you did wrong by not trying to control the situation any further. After we hung up, I sat in my empty house thinking about the past 5 years. Tom was right that I'd become increasingly isolated, increasingly focused on professional achievements as a substitute for personal relationships. I'd confused influence with wisdom, power with righteousness. Wednesday morning, I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed over 30 years in business. I called Robert Chen. Robert, this is Patricia Kellerman. I'd like to meet with you again if you're willing. For what? I want to discuss how I might help the people who lost their jobs because of my actions. There was a long pause. I'm listening. I'm prepared to provide financial assistance to help bridge the gap while they look for new employment, and I'd like to use my network to help them find new positions. Why would you do that? Because you were right yesterday. I caused harm to innocent people, and I need to take responsibility for that harm. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Robert arrived with the same folder he'd brought to my office, along with a legal pad covered in notes. Before we discuss any assistance, I need to understand your motivations. Are you trying to buy forgiveness, mitigate legal exposure, or do you genuinely want to help?
I genuinely want to help. What I did was wrong, and people are suffering because of my choices. That's not something I can live with. Robert studied my face for signs of deception. What kind of assistance are you talking about? 3 months of salary continuation for each person who was terminated, and I'll personally reach out to my contacts at other agencies and companies to recommend them for available positions. That's a significant financial commitment. It's the least I can do given the damage I've caused. Robert made notes on his legal pad. I'll need to discuss this with the affected employees. Some of them might not want assistance from the person who caused their unemployment in the first place. I understand. If they prefer, we can structure it as assistance from Meridian Creative rather than directly from me. Whatever makes them most comfortable. And what about Vanessa Sterling? Are you prepared to acknowledge publicly that your campaign against her was personal rather than professional? This was the question I'd been dreading. Publicly admitting that I'd misused my professional relationships would damage my reputation permanently. It would also vindicate Vanessa and potentially help her salvage her career. If that's what it takes to help the people who were harmed, yes. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying me with surprise. I didn't expect you to be willing to go that far. I've been thinking about this situation for days, trying to understand how I became someone who would use professional influence for personal revenge. I don't like what I've discovered about myself. What have you discovered? That I've become someone who confused power with righteousness. Someone who was so used to solving problems through manipulation that I forgot how to handle personal conflicts directly and honestly. Robert made more notes. If you're serious about public acknowledgement, I think that could go a long way toward helping everyone involved, including Vanessa. What do you mean? Right now, her reputation in the industry is destroyed. No one will hire her because they believe the professional conduct concerns were legitimate. If you publicly acknowledge that your concerns were personally motivated, it might open doors for her to rebuild her career. The irony wasn't lost on me. To truly make amends for my revenge, I would have to actively help the person I'd tried to destroy. I'll do whatever is necessary, I said. Over the next week, I worked with Robert to structure assistance for the terminated employees. 3 agreed to accept financial help. 2 found new positions through my network contacts. 1, Maria Rodriguez, initially refused my assistance, but eventually accepted when her unemployment benefits were delayed. The hardest conversation was with James Mitchell, the expectant father who just bought his first house. He met me at the same coffee shop where I'd worked out the arrangements with Robert. "Why are you doing this?" he asked directly. Robert told me what happened, how this whole thing started because of a personal conflict between you and Vanessa. Because my personal vendetta cost you your job, and that's not something I can live with.
But you didn't know me when you started making those phone calls. You didn't think about how it might affect people like me. You're right. I was so focused on punishing someone who had hurt me that I didn't consider the broader consequences of my actions. James was quiet for a moment, studying my face. My wife and we've been talking about this situation a lot, trying to understand how someone could be so vindictive over something so petty. His words stung, but I forced myself to listen. The thing is, he continued, we decided that maybe this says more about you than about us. Maybe you're someone who has been powerful for so long that you forgot how your actions affect ordinary people. I think you're right about that. So, when you help me find a new job, when you pay my salary for 3 months, is that supposed to make me grateful to you? Is that supposed to make this whole thing okay? No. Nothing I do can make this okay. I'm helping because it's the right thing to do, not because I expect forgiveness or gratitude. James nodded slowly. Good, because I don't forgive you, and I'm not grateful. You destroyed my financial security to settle a personal score, and no amount of money changes that. I understand. But I'll take your help finding a new job because my family needs the income. Just don't expect me to pretend this was anything other than what it was. After James left, I sat alone in the coffee shop thinking about accountability. I'd spent my career in positions where accountability was often diffused through corporate structures and committee decisions. Rarely had I faced someone who had been directly harmed by my choices and demanded that I acknowledge the full scope of that harm. Thursday evening, Marcus called me for the first time since our confrontation at my house. Mom, I heard about what you're doing for the people who lost their jobs. Who told you? Robert Ken. Vanessa knows him through industry connections. He said you're providing financial assistance and helping people find new positions. It's the least I can do. He also said you're prepared to make a public statement acknowledging that your concerns about Vanessa were personally motivated rather than professionally legitimate. That's correct? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Why are you doing this? Because I was wrong, sweetheart. Not just about my methods, but about my motivations. I let my hurt feelings drive me to abuse my professional relationships, and innocent people suffered as a result. Do you still think Vanessa deserved what happened to her?
I thought carefully before answering. I think Vanessa said something cruel and hurtful, and I think she has some character issues that affect her professional relationships. But no, I don't think she deserved to have her career destroyed over a thoughtless comment made during a stressful family situation. A stressful family situation? Marcus, I've been thinking about that lunch, trying to understand why she said what she said. You told me she'd been under pressure at work, dealing with difficult clients and increased scrutiny. She was probably feeling defensive and lashed out at an easy target. So you're saying she was just having a bad day? I'm saying that people sometimes say cruel things when they're feeling cornered or stressed, and that doesn't necessarily reflect their core character. I should have given her the benefit of the doubt instead of assuming the worst about her motivations. Marcus was quiet again. I don't know what to say, Mom. Part of me is relieved that you're taking responsibility for what you did, but part of me is angry that it took destroying 6 people's livelihoods for you to realize you'd gone too far. You're right to be angry. I should have recognized the disproportion between her offense and my response before I started making phone calls. Are you doing this because you want me to come back? Because you think making amends will fix our relationship? I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, regardless of what happens between us. If you decide to stay in Portland, if you decide our relationship can't be repaired, I'll respect that decision. I appreciate you saying that. It means a lot that you're not trying to manipulate the situation to get what you want. I've done enough manipulating to last a lifetime.
From now on, I want to try handling relationships directly and honestly. What does that mean? It means that if I have problems with someone, I'll address those problems with them directly instead of trying to orchestrate consequences behind the scenes. It means I'll try to remember that being powerful doesn't give me the right to play with other people's lives. Marcus was quiet for several minutes. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think you can actually change? Do you think you can learn to handle personal conflicts without turning them into professional warfare? I thought about this question seriously. I don't know, Marcus. I've been operating this way for so long that it feels natural to me. But I want to change, and I'm willing to do the work to figure out how. What kind of work? Therapy, probably. I need to understand why I reacted so disproportionately to Vanessa's comment, why I felt the need to destroy her career instead of just addressing the issue directly with her. You're going to see a therapist? I'm going to try. I need to figure out why I became someone who could justify causing so much collateral damage to innocent people. Friday morning, I met with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in executive coaching and workplace behavior. Her office was warm and comfortable, designed to put high-powered clients at ease while discussing their most difficult challenges. "Tell me, what brought you here?" she said after we'd settled into facing chairs. I told her the entire story, from Vanessa's cruel comment to my systematic campaign of professional destruction to the collateral damage that had resulted. Dr. Chen listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my thought process at various stages. When Vanessa made that comment about your smell, what did you feel in that moment? Humiliated. Angry. Like she had deliberately chosen the most hurtful thing she could say to undermine my dignity in front of my son. And what did that humiliation feel like? Can you describe the physical sensation? I thought back to that moment in the restaurant. Like being slapped. Like everyone in the restaurant was suddenly looking at me and seeing an old woman who didn't belong in polite company. That's a very intense reaction to a thoughtless comment. What do you think made it feel so devastating? I suppose because it played into my deepest fears about aging, about becoming invisible and irrelevant. Dr. Chen made notes. Tell me about those fears. Since my husband died, I've felt increasingly isolated. My social life was built around couples activities, and most of my friendships were really his friendships. Work became my primary source of identity and self-worth. So when Vanessa attacked your personal dignity in a professional setting, it felt like an assault on the only identity you had left. Yes, exactly. And your response was to use your professional identity to destroy her professional identity. I sat back in my chair, struck by the symmetry she'd identified. I made her feel professionally what she'd made me feel personally. How does that understanding change your perspective on what you did? It makes me realize that I was acting out of wounded pride rather than righteous anger. I wasn't seeking justice, I was seeking revenge. Dr. Chen nodded. What do you think might have happened if you'd addressed your feelings directly with Vanessa instead of orchestrating professional consequences? She probably would have apologized. She might have explained that she was having a bad day or feeling stressed about work. We might have been able to resolve the conflict and move forward. Instead, you chose to handle it through manipulation and power plays. Because that's how I've learned to handle problems, through strategic thinking and leveraging relationships and controlling outcomes. And how has that approach affected your personal relationships? I thought about my isolation since David's death, my difficulty maintaining friendships outside of professional contexts, and my tendency to view interpersonal conflicts as problems to be solved rather than relationships to be navigated.
It's turned me into someone who manipulates situations instead of connecting with people, someone who controls rather than communicates. What would you like to change about that pattern? I want to learn how to have direct conversations about difficult topics. I want to stop seeing personal conflicts as problems to be solved through strategic manipulation. What would that look like in practice? If someone hurts my feelings, I want to tell them directly instead of plotting ways to hurt them back. If I have concerns about someone's behavior, I want to address those concerns with them rather than undermining them professionally. Dr. Chen smiled. Those are significant changes for someone who's spent decades solving problems through influence and control. Are you prepared for how difficult that transition might be? I have to be, because the alternative is losing my son and becoming someone I don't recognize or respect. Over the following weeks, I worked with Dr. Chen to understand the psychological patterns that had led to my disproportionate response to Vanessa's comment. We explored my fears about aging and irrelevance, my tendency to conflate professional success with personal worth, and my difficulty forming authentic relationships outside of strategic alliances. The work was harder than any professional challenge I'd ever faced because it required acknowledging fundamental flaws in how I understood myself and my relationships with others. Meanwhile, I followed through on my commitment to help the people who'd been harmed by my actions. Maria Rodriguez found a new position at a competing agency through one of my contacts. James Mitchell interviewed for several positions, ultimately accepting an offer at a medical device company where I'd worked as a consultant. The hardest part was preparing my public statement, acknowledging that my concerns about Vanessa had been personally rather than professionally motivated. Working with Robert Chen and a public relations consultant, I crafted a statement that took full responsibility for misusing my professional relationships while clarifying that the issues I'd raised were not based on legitimate professional standards. The statement was published in the industry newsletter and posted on my LinkedIn profile. The response was swift and brutal. Colleagues who'd respected my judgment for decades questioned my integrity. Professional relationships that had taken years to build were damaged overnight. Consulting opportunities dried up as potential clients wondered whether I could separate personal feelings from professional advice. But the statement also had its intended effect. Within 2 weeks of its publication, Vanessa received 3 interview requests from agencies that had previously considered her unhireable. The cloud of professional suspicion that had surrounded her began to lift as industry professionals realized the concerns about her conduct had been personally motivated rather than objectively assessed. Marcus called me the evening the statement was published. "Mom, I saw what you wrote. That must have been incredibly difficult." It was the right thing to do. It's going to affect your reputation permanently, isn't it? Probably, but my reputation was built on people trusting my professional judgment. If I can't separate personal feelings from professional assessments, then maybe my reputation needed to be reconsidered. I'm proud of you for doing this, even though it cost you so much. Are you and Vanessa still planning to move to Portland? Marcus was quiet for a moment. We're reconsidering. With your statement helping to clear her reputation, she might be able to rebuild her career here. And honestly, after seeing how you've handled making amends, I'm not ready to write off our relationship entirely. What does that mean? It means I'm willing to try rebuilding our relationship, but with different ground rules. No more professional manipulation, no more behind-the-scenes orchestration. If you have problems with the people in my life, you address those problems directly and honestly. I agree to those terms. And it means that Vanessa and I need to have a direct conversation with you about what happened. She needs to understand how her comment affected you, and you need to understand how your response affected her. The prospect of sitting down with Vanessa, of having an honest conversation about our conflict, terrified me more than any boardroom negotiation I'd ever faced. But it was exactly the kind of direct communication I needed to learn how to handle. When would you like to have that conversation? Soon. But first, I think you should know that Vanessa wants to apologize to you. She's realized that her comment was cruel and thoughtless, regardless of what stress she was under at the time.
And I need to apologize to her for the disproportionate response to that comment. Yes, but Mom, this conversation has to be about genuine accountability and repair, not about positioning or strategy. Can you handle that? I'm going to try. I've been working with a therapist to learn how to have direct conversations about difficult topics instead of trying to control outcomes through manipulation. You're seeing a therapist? Twice a week. I need to understand why I became someone who could justify destroying multiple people's lives over a personal slight. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. That gives me hope, Mom. Real hope that we can rebuild something authentic between us. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the photos of Marcus that lined the mantelpiece. In the most recent picture, taken at his last birthday dinner, he was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd been so focused on his professional success and financial security that I'd failed to notice how isolated he had become, how much he needed authentic emotional support rather than strategic life management. My relationship with my son had become another project to be managed rather than a connection to be nurtured. If I wanted to rebuild it, I would have to learn how to be a mother rather than a strategic advisor. The work would be difficult, requiring me to abandon decades of learned behavior and develop entirely new approaches to interpersonal conflict. But sitting in my empty house, surrounded by the wreckage of relationships I damaged through manipulation and control, I understood that change wasn't optional. It was the only path back to the person I wanted to be and the relationships that mattered most. 3 weeks later, Marcus arranged the meeting I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He suggested neutral territory, a quiet corner booth at Carmichael's, a family restaurant where we'd celebrated many of his childhood milestones. The familiarity of the setting was both comforting and surreal given the gravity of what we were about to discuss. I arrived 15 minutes early, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Dr. Chen had coached me extensively on this conversation, helping me prepare for direct communication without strategic positioning. No manipulation, no attempts to control the narrative, just honest acknowledgement of harm caused and genuine willingness to repair the damage. Vanessa entered Hearst, wearing a simple navy dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her.
Gone was the calculated perfection I'd come to associate with her appearance. Her makeup was minimal, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there was something in her posture that suggested genuine nervousness rather than defensive armor. Marcus followed her to the table, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes watchful. He was clearly prepared to moderate this conversation if it went badly, ready to protect both women from further harm. We sat in awkward silence for several moments, each waiting for someone else to begin. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Patricia, I want to start by apologizing for what I said to you at lunch. That comment about you smelling like old people was cruel and thoughtless, and I've regretted it every day since." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated performance, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Thank you for saying that, Vanessa. I accept your apology. I need you to understand that I wasn't trying to be deliberately hurtful. I was having a terrible week at work, feeling defensive about everything, and when my colleague made that comment about your perfume, I just reacted badly." "What exactly did your colleague say?" Vanessa glanced at Marcus before continuing. She made a snide comment about older women who wear too much perfume and how it was embarrassing to be associated with that kind of outdated style. I was already feeling insecure about fitting in with Marcus's family, and instead of defending you, I let her comments influence how I spoke to you. The revelation hit me unexpectedly. I'd assumed Vanessa's cruelty had been entirely her own, but she'd been influenced by someone else's thoughtless comments and had redirected that negativity toward me rather than standing up for our family. "So you were feeling attacked and passed that attack along to me?" "Yes, and that was cowardly and wrong. I should have told Rachel that her comment was inappropriate instead of using it as ammunition against you.
Marcus leaned forward slightly. Mom, Vanessa wanted you to understand the context because she knows it doesn't excuse what she said, but it explains why she reacted so defensively. I nodded slowly. Vanessa, I appreciate you telling me that. It helps me understand that your comment wasn't premeditated cruelty, even though it felt that way to me. It wasn't premeditated, but it was still cruel, and I need you to know that I understand why you were so hurt by it. We sat quietly for a moment, the weight of mutual acknowledgement settling between us. Then Vanessa continued, her voice becoming stronger. But Patricia, I also need you to understand what your response did to my life, not just professionally, but personally and emotionally. I braced myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I'm ready to hear that. You destroyed my career systematically and deliberately. You used relationships and influence that took me years to build, and you turned them against me without giving me any opportunity to defend myself or explain my actions. The words were delivered without anger, which somehow made them more powerful. If she'd screamed at me, I could have dismissed her as emotional or unstable, but her calm recitation of facts was undeniable and devastating. You made phone calls to people I'd worked with for years, raising concerns about my professional conduct that you presented as objective observations when they were actually personal revenge. You damaged relationships I'd spent months building, questioning my integrity with clients who had no context for understanding your motivations. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I forced myself to listen without defending or explaining. The worst part wasn't even losing my job. The worst part was feeling like I was going crazy, like I couldn't trust my own perception of reality. Suddenly, everyone was questioning my professionalism based on vague reports and unnamed concerns. I started doubting every interaction I'd ever had, wondering if I really was as problematic as people were suddenly claiming. Marcus reached over to squeeze her hand, and I saw tears forming in her eyes for the first time since I'd known her. I've never felt so powerless in my life. Someone I barely knew had the ability to destroy everything I had worked for, and there was nothing I could do to defend myself because I didn't even know what I was being accused of. The full impact of what I had done was becoming clear in a way that it hadn't been when I was focused on the righteous satisfaction of consequences delivered. I'd made Vanessa feel exactly as powerless and vulnerable as her comment had made me feel, but I'd done it through calculated professional assassination rather than momentary cruelty. Vanessa, I am deeply sorry for what I put you through. You're right that my response was completely disproportionate to your offense, and you're right that I used my professional relationships inappropriately to settle a personal score. Why did you do it that way? Why didn't you just tell me directly that I'd hurt your feelings? The question was fair and difficult. Because I was so angry and humiliated that I wanted you to suffer consequences rather than just feel bad about what you'd said. I wanted you to experience professional vulnerability the way you made me experience personal vulnerability. So it was revenge. Yes, it was revenge dressed up as concern for professional standards, but it was fundamentally about making you pay for hurting me. Vanessa nodded slowly. At least you're being honest about that now. Marcus had been listening silently, but now he spoke up. Mom, Vanessa wanted you to understand how this affected me, watching two people I love hurt each other in increasingly destructive ways. I turned to look at my son, seeing pain in his face that I'd been too focused on my own anger to notice before. Mom, when Vanessa made that comment about your smell, I was mortified. I wanted to crawl under the table, but I also knew she was having a hard time at work and was probably not thinking clearly. You should have said something to defend me in the moment. You're right, I should have. I was conflict avoidant and tried to smooth things over privately instead of addressing the problem directly. That was my mistake. Marcus looked between Vanessa and me. But Mom, when I realized what you'd done professionally, I felt like I didn't know you anymore. The mother who raised me to stand up for people who couldn't defend themselves had used her power to systematically destroy someone who couldn't fight back. The words cut deeply because they reflected the disconnect between my self-perception and my actual behavior. I'd told myself I was standing up for professional standards when I was actually abusing professional relationships. And Vanessa, Marcus continued, when you made that comment about Mom, you attacked the most important person in my life in a way that was designed to humiliate her. Even if you were having a bad day, that was unacceptable. Vanessa nodded, tears flowing freely now.
I know. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, wishing I could take it back. So where do we go from here? Marcus asked. How do we rebuild trust when both of you have shown that you're capable of deliberately hurting people you're supposed to care about? The question hung in the air, highlighting the fundamental issue underlying our entire conflict. This wasn't just about a thoughtless comment or disproportionate revenge. It was about whether we could learn to treat each other with basic respect and kindness. I think, I said carefully, we start by agreeing on some ground rules for how we handle conflicts in the future. What kind of ground rules? Vanessa asked. If someone hurts your feelings or behaves inappropriately, you address it directly with them instead of attacking back or involving third parties. No more indirect punishment, no more professional retaliation, no more public humiliation. Marcus nodded. Direct communication about problems instead of strategic warfare. And, Vanessa added, we give each other the benefit of the doubt when someone says or does something hurtful. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're stressed about something else. Maybe they just made a mistake. Assuming good intentions until proven otherwise, I agreed. We spent the next hour working through specific scenarios, practicing how we would handle various conflicts using direct communication rather than retaliation or manipulation. It felt artificial and forced, but it was necessary groundwork for rebuilding trust. As we prepared to leave, Vanessa surprised me by asking, Patricia, would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime? Just the two of us, without Marcus mediating? The request caught me off guard. Why would you want to do that? Because I think we both learned something important about each other today. You're not the controlling monster I'd convinced myself you were, and I hope I'm not the shallow gold digger you thought I was. Maybe we could try getting to know each other as people instead of as threats. I thought about Dr. Chen's advice about building authentic relationships based on genuine connection rather than strategic positioning. I'd like that. Marcus smiled for the first time all evening. This is good. This is really good. As we walked to our cars, I reflected on how different this conversation had been from any interaction I'd had with Vanessa before. Without the armor of manipulation and defensiveness, we'd both revealed vulnerability and humanity that had been invisible when we were treating each other as enemies. The following week, Vanessa and I met for coffee at a small cafe near her apartment. She looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen her, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Thank you for agreeing to this, she said as we settled into a corner table with our drinks. Thank you for suggesting it. I wasn't sure you'd ever want to speak to me again after what I did to your career. Honestly, I wasn't sure either. But I've been thinking about our conversation with Marcus, and I realized that staying angry wasn't helping anyone. We spent the first few minutes making awkward small talk about the weather and the coffee shop's atmosphere. Then Vanessa asked the question I'd been expecting. Patricia, can you help me understand why my comment about your smell affected you so deeply? I know it was cruel, but your reaction seemed like it went beyond just being hurt by thoughtless words. I considered how much personal information to share with someone who was still essentially a stranger, despite being engaged to my son. But Dr. Chen had emphasized the importance of authentic communication, even when it felt risky. Since my husband died 5 years ago, I've felt increasingly invisible and irrelevant. My social life was built around couple friendships that mostly ended when I became a widow. Work became my primary source of identity and self-worth. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her expression growing more compassionate as I continued. When you made that comment about me smelling like old people, It hit every insecurity I have about aging and becoming someone that younger people find embarrassing or repulsive. It felt like confirmation of the worst fears I have about myself. I had no idea you were dealing with those feelings. How could you? We barely knew each other, and I'd never shared anything personal about my experience as a widow or my fears about aging. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, processing what I told her. My father died when I was 16. I watched my mother struggle with exactly the same feelings you're describing: the invisibility, the irrelevance, the sense that she'd become someone people pitied rather than respected. This was the first personal information Vanessa had ever shared with me about her family background. How did she handle those feelings? She threw herself into volunteer work and eventually went back to school to become a nurse. She said she needed to feel useful again, needed to know that she mattered to people other than just me. Is she still nursing? She retired last year, but she volunteers at a free clinic twice a week. She says helping people makes her feel vital in a way that nothing else does. I found myself genuinely curious about Vanessa's mother and her experience rebuilding her life after loss. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. And Patricia, she would be horrified if she knew I'd made that comment about your smell. She raised me to respect older people and understand that aging is a privilege that not everyone gets to experience. Why didn't you think about that before you said it? Vanessa sighed, looking genuinely ashamed. Because I was feeling defensive and insecure, and I took the easy path of punching down instead of standing up for what I knew was right. My mother would say I forgot my raising, as she puts it. The phrase made me smile, despite the serious nature of our conversation. Your mother sounds like she has some colorful expressions. She does. She also has very strong opinions about treating people with kindness, regardless of how they treat you. She says, cruelty is always a choice, and it's always the wrong choice. I wish I'd remembered that when I was deciding how to respond to your comment. And I wish I'd remembered it when I was deciding how to respond to my colleague's nasty remarks about your perfume. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in thought about the choices we'd made and the values we'd forgotten to apply when we were feeling defensive. Patricia, can I ask you something else? Of course. When you were building your campaign against my career, did you ever think about just talking to me directly about why my comment had hurt you? I thought back to those first days after the lunch, when I'd been consumed with anger and humiliation. Honestly, no. I was so focused on the fact that you deliberately humiliated me that I never considered the possibility of direct conversation leading to resolution. Why not? Because I assumed you'd said what you'd said on purpose, to put me in my place or assert dominance in our relationship. I thought direct confrontation would just give you another opportunity to be cruel. Vanessa nodded slowly. So you decided to be cruel first before I could hurt you again. Yes, exactly. I understand that impulse. When people hurt me, my first instinct is usually to hurt them back before they can do it again. But you didn't try to hurt me back professionally when I destroyed your career. Because I couldn't. You had power and connections that I didn't have access to. If I could have destroyed your career the way you destroyed mine, I probably would have tried. The honesty of her admission was both refreshing and sobering. We were both capable of revenge when we felt threatened. The difference had been opportunity and resources, not character. That's a disturbing thought, I said. Why? Because it suggests that the main thing preventing us from hurting each other is practical limitations rather than moral constraints. Vanessa considered this. Maybe. But it also suggests that if we can learn to communicate directly about problems instead of looking for ways to hurt each other, we might be able to avoid testing those moral constraints. You mean if we address conflicts before they escalate to the point where revenge seems justified? Exactly. If I'd talked to you directly about feeling insecure around your family, maybe I wouldn't have been so defensive when my colleague made that comment about your perfume. And if you'd told me immediately that my comment had hurt you, maybe I could have apologized sincerely before you decided I was a threat that needed to be neutralized.
The conversation was revealing patterns in both our behaviors that went beyond the specific conflict we'd experienced. We were both defensive, both prone to assuming the worst about other people's motivations, both inclined toward retaliation when we felt attacked. Vanessa, can I ask you about something Marcus mentioned, about feeling insecure around our family? She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. What do you want to know? I want to understand what I might have done to make you feel unwelcome, even before the situation escalated. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. You never did anything overtly unwelcoming, but I always felt like you were evaluating me, judging whether I was good enough for Marcus. I was. All mothers evaluate their children's romantic partners. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, it felt like I was constantly failing tests I didn't know I was taking, like there was some standard of worthiness that I couldn't identify or meet. I thought about my interactions with Vanessa before our conflict, trying to remember specific instances where I might have conveyed judgment or disapproval. Can you give me an example? The first time Marcus brought me to your house for dinner, you asked about my education, my career goals, my family background. All normal questions, but the way you asked them felt like an interview rather than getting to know you conversation. I was right. I had approached that dinner with an agenda of gathering information to assess her suitability rather than genuinely trying to connect with her as a person. And when I mentioned that I'd studied marketing but wasn't sure about my long-term career plans, you suggested several books about professional development and strategic career planning. It felt like you were telling me I wasn't ambitious enough for your son. I was trying to be helpful. I know, but it came across as criticism disguised as assistance. I reflected on this feedback, recognizing a pattern in how I approached relationships. Even when trying to be supportive, I tended towards strategic problem-solving rather than emotional connection. I can see how that would feel judgmental rather than supportive. And then there were smaller things. Comments about Marcus working too hard, suggestions that he needed better work-life balance. It felt like you were implying that I wasn't taking good enough care of him. These are valid observations about my behavior. I had been evaluating Vanessa's worthiness as a partner for Marcus, and I had been subtle but persistent in communicating my reservations. You're right. I was judging you, and I was communicating that judgment in ways that were designed to make you feel inadequate. Why? Because I was afraid of losing my relationship with Marcus to someone who might not value him appropriately or treat him well. So you tried to make me feel like I wasn't good enough for him. Yes, and that was unfair and counterproductive. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, looking thoughtful. It's ironic, isn't it? Your attempts to protect Marcus from someone who might not treat him well led you to treat me badly, which ultimately damaged your relationship with him more than my supposed inadequacies ever could have. She was absolutely right. My protective instincts had manifested in ways that were more harmful to Marcus than any deficiencies in Vanessa's character could have been. I created the very problem I was trying to prevent. And I responded to your subtle hostility by becoming more defensive and less willing to try building a genuine relationship with you, which probably confirmed your suspicions that I wasn't committed to becoming a part of your family. So we created a cycle of mistrust and defensiveness that made genuine connection impossible. Until it all exploded with that comment about your smell. We sat quietly, both processing the complex dynamics that had led to our mutual destruction. It was humbling to realize how much damage we had done through misunderstanding and defensive reactions. Vanessa, if we're going to try building a real relationship, I need to know that you're not going to use your professional influence against me again if we have conflicts. You have my word that I will never again use professional relationships to address personal conflicts.
How can I trust that? How do I know you won't decide I'm a threat again and find new ways to undermine me?
The question was fair and difficult. Trust, once broken, required more than promises to rebuild. I'm working with a therapist to change my approach to interpersonal conflicts. I'm learning to communicate directly about problems instead of strategizing ways to control or punish people. What does that look like in practice? It means that if you do something that hurts my feelings or concerns me about your relationship with Marcus, I'll talk to you directly about it, instead of looking for ways to create consequences for your behavior. Even if I'm not receptive to that conversation, even if I get defensive or dismiss your concerns, even then, because the alternative is the kind of destruction we just experienced, and that doesn't serve anyone's interests, including Marcus's. Vanessa nodded slowly. I can accept that, but I need to offer you the same commitment. If you do something that makes me feel judged or unwelcome, I'll talk to you directly instead of becoming defensive and saying cruel things. Even if those conversations are uncomfortable, even then, because you're right that the alternative is much worse. We shook hands across the table, a formal gesture that felt appropriate for the serious commitment we were making to each other. As we prepared to leave, Vanessa surprised me again. Patricia, would you like to have dinner next week? Not at a restaurant, at my apartment. I'd like to cook for you. You don't have to do that. I want to. I want you to see me in my own space, doing something I enjoy, being myself rather than the defensive person I become when I feel like I'm being evaluated. I'd like that very much. The dinner at Vanessa's apartment the following week was a revelation. Her small space was decorated with photographs from travels, artwork from local artists, and books ranging from marketing texts to historical fiction. She moved around her kitchen with confidence, preparing a meal that required genuine skill and attention. Where did you learn to cook like this? I asked, watching her prepare a complex sauce with practiced ease. My mother. She said that knowing how to cook well was a form of independence, a way to take care of yourself and show care for others. The meal she prepared was restaurant quality, each dish carefully planned and expertly executed. As we ate, she told me stories about learning to cook from her mother, about travel experiences that had influenced her palate, about our hopes of someday taking a culinary tour of Italy. This is incredible, Vanessa. You're genuinely talented at this. Thank you. Cooking is my escape from work stress. There's something soothing about the precision and creativity required. I was seeing aspects of her personality that had been completely invisible when we were treating each other as adversaries. She was thoughtful, creative, passionate about things that had nothing to do with professional advancement or social positioning. Have you ever considered making this more than a hobby? Sometimes, but the restaurant industry is brutal, and I've invested so much time building my marketing career that starting over feels too risky. What if risk wasn't a factor? What if you could explore culinary interests without giving up financial security? Vanessa looked at me curiously. What do you mean? I mean that there are ways to build culinary skills and explore that passion while maintaining your primary career. Consulting for restaurants on their marketing, food writing, catering is a side business. I hadn't thought about combining the two interests. You have marketing expertise and genuine culinary passion. That's a powerful combination in an industry that often struggles with effective promotion. We spent the rest of the evening discussing possibilities for integrating her interests, ways she might explore her passion for cooking while leveraging her professional skills. It was the first conversation we'd ever had that felt genuinely collaborative rather than evaluative. As I prepared to leave, Vanessa walked me to the door. Patricia, thank you for tonight. Not just for coming to dinner, but for seeing me as a person with interests and dreams, rather than just as someone dating your son. Thank you for showing me who you really are when you're not feeling defensive. I hope we can keep building on this. I do too. Driving home, I reflected on how much my perception of Vanessa had changed over the course of a few hours. When I'd known her only in the context of family gatherings and formal interactions, she'd seemed shallow and self-absorbed. But in her own space, talking about things she cared about, she'd revealed depth and passion that I found genuinely appealing.
it occurred to me that my initial judgments about her character had been based on incomplete information gathered in artificial settings. I'd never given her the opportunity to show me who she was beyond the defensive persona she adopted when she felt like she was being evaluated. The following month brought unexpected developments. Vanessa received a job offer from a boutique marketing firm that specialized in hospitality and restaurant consulting. The position would allow her to combine her marketing skills with her interest in food and cooking, exactly the kind of integration we'd discussed at dinner. She called to tell me about the opportunity, her voice bright with excitement. "Patricia, I wanted you to be one of the first to know. I got the job at Culinary Communications." "That's wonderful news. When do you start?" "In 2 weeks. And Patricia, I want you to know that our conversation about combining my interests is what gave me the confidence to pursue this opportunity. If you hadn't helped me see the possibilities, I might never have applied." The irony wasn't lost on me. After destroying her previous career out of spite, I'd inadvertently helped her find a better path that was more aligned with her genuine interests and talents. I'm glad our conversation was helpful, but the initiative and talent that got you this job are entirely your own. Still, I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to have lunch next week to celebrate. I'd be honored. The celebration lunch was at the same restaurant where our conflict had begun months earlier. But this time, we sat at a different table in a different section, creating new associations with the space rather than reliving old traumas.
How does it feel to be starting over professionally? I asked as we reviewed our menus. Terrifying and exciting. I'm nervous about proving myself in a new industry, but I'm also thrilled to be working on projects that genuinely interest me. Change is always scary, even when it's positive. Patricia, can I ask you about something personal? Of course. Marcus told me that you've been considering making some changes in your own work situation. Something about reducing your consulting load and exploring other interests? I was surprised that Marcus had shared this information, though pleased that he felt comfortable discussing my life with Vanessa. I've been thinking about it. Working with Dr. Chen has made me realize that I've used professional achievement as a substitute for personal fulfillment for too long. What kind of other interests are you considering? I'm not sure yet. Maybe volunteer work, maybe going back to school for something completely different. I spent so many years focused on climbing the corporate ladder that I never explored what else might bring me satisfaction. What did you enjoy before you got caught up in career advancement? I thought back to my 20s, before marriage and motherhood and professional ambition had consumed my attention. I used to love literature. I read voraciously, wrote terrible poetry, dreamed of teaching college courses on Victorian novels. What stopped you from pursuing that? Life, I suppose. Marriage, pregnancy, the need for steady income. Academic careers seemed too uncertain compared to corporate advancement. But you don't need career uncertainty now. You could explore those interests purely for enjoyment. You're right. I could audit literature courses, join a book club, even try writing again without worrying about whether it leads to professional advancement. Vanessa smiled. It's funny how we both ended up in careers that felt safe rather than fulfilling, and we're both finally at stages where we can prioritize what actually interests us. Maybe that's part of why we clashed so intensely. We were both living lives that didn't entirely fit who we really are, and that made us defensive and reactive. That's a generous interpretation, but possibly accurate. People who are fulfilled and secure in their choices don't usually lash out as viciously as we did. As we finished lunch, Vanessa brought up a topic I'd been wondering about but hadn't felt comfortable raising. "Patricia, Marcus and I have been talking about moving forward with wedding planning again. We put everything on hold after our conflict, but we're ready to start thinking about the future. How do you both feel about that?" Nervous, but optimistic. We've learned a lot about communication and conflict resolution over the past few months. I think we're better prepared for marriage now than we were before everything fell apart. What about the wedding itself? Are you planning something different than what you'd originally envisioned? Smaller, more intimate. We want to focus on the commitment we're making rather than creating a big production. And Patricia, we'd like you to be involved in the planning this time, if you're interested. The offer surprised me. Are you sure? After everything that happened? Because of everything that happened, we want to build this celebration together as a family rather than treating it like competing visions of what the day should be. I'd love to be involved. Good, because we're thinking about having the ceremony at Marcus's house in the backyard. Small guest list, simple ceremony, reception with food that actually means something to us rather than what's expected at formal weddings. That sounds perfect for both of you. We were hoping you might help us plan the menu. Nothing too elaborate, but food that reflects our personalities and brings people together. The request was touching because it acknowledged my relationship with Vanessa had evolved beyond mere tolerance into genuine collaboration. She was inviting me to contribute something meaningful to their celebration. I'd be honored to help with the menu planning. As we walked to our cars after lunch, Vanessa surprised me with an unexpected question. Patricia, do you think we would have eventually found our way to this kind of relationship if the conflict over my comment hadn't forced us to examine our behavior? I considered the question seriously. Honestly, I don't think so. I think we would have continued in a polite but superficial relationship, both feeling defensive and misunderstood, but never addressing the underlying dynamics. So, you think the crisis was necessary for us to build something authentic? Not necessary exactly, but maybe inevitable. We were both operating from places of insecurity and defensiveness. Without some kind of confrontation that forced us to be honest about our behavior, we probably just would have maintained a cold peace that satisfied no one. That's a disturbing thought. Why? Because it suggests that sometimes relationships have to be damaged before they can be repaired properly. Or maybe it suggests that relationships built on politeness and surface-level interaction aren't really relationships at all, just performance agreements. Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. What we have now feels more real than what we had before, even though it's built on acknowledging some pretty ugly truths about both of us. I agree. We know now that we're both capable of cruelty when we feel threatened, but we're also both capable of taking responsibility for that cruelty and choosing to do better. And we know that we can have difficult conversations and emerge with greater understanding rather than greater hostility. Most importantly, we know that Marcus benefits when the people he loves treat each other with respect and kindness, even when that requires uncomfortable honesty. As I drove home, I reflected on the journey Vanessa and I had taken from mutual hostility to genuine friendship. It hadn't been easy or straightforward, and it had required both of us to abandon defensive strategies we'd relied on for years. But the relationship we had built was stronger than what we had started with, because it was based on honest acknowledgement of our flaws rather than careful management of our images. We'd seen each other at our worst and chosen to believe in each other's capacity for growth and change.
That evening, Marcus called to check in on how the lunch had gone. Vanessa said you two had a really good conversation about the wedding planning. We did. I'm excited to be involved this time. Mom, I need to tell you how proud I am of the work you've done to rebuild this relationship. I know it hasn't been easy. It's been worth every difficult conversation. I feel like I'm finally getting to know Vanessa as a person rather than as a threat to our relationship. And how do you feel about her now that you know her better? I think she's exactly the kind of person you deserve. Someone who challenges you to be better, who supports your dreams, who brings out your best qualities while accepting your worst ones. That means everything to me, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to see her clearly. I was so focused on protecting our relationship that I couldn't see how my protective instincts were actually damaging it. We're all learning how to do this better. The important thing is that we're committed to treating each other with honesty and respect going forward. As we ended the call, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild relationships I'd nearly destroyed through my own defensiveness and need for control. The work had been difficult, requiring me to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about my behavior and motivations. But the relationships I'd built through that work were stronger and more authentic than anything I'd experienced in years. I'd learned to connect with people as a person rather than as a strategic player. And that shift had opened possibilities for genuine intimacy and mutual support that I hadn't known I was missing. The foundation for a real family was finally in place, built on honesty, accountability, and the shared commitment to treat each other with kindness, even when it was difficult. The wedding planning ahead would be our first test of whether we could maintain that foundation under the stress of coordinating a major life event, but I was optimistic about our chances. 6 months later, I stood in Marcus's backyard, watching Vanessa adjust her simple white dress while guests gathered under string lights we'd hung together the night before. The wedding was everything they'd wanted, intimate and meaningful, celebrating love rather than displaying wealth. As I walked Vanessa down the aisle to Marcus, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that families can choose to love each other even after they've hurt each other." I squeezed back, tears blurring my vision as I realized we'd all learned to smell like something better than our worst moments. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, scattered laughter rippled through the small gathering as guests remembered our dramatic history. But this time, I stood silently, smiling with genuine joy as my son married a woman I'd come to deeply respect and love. During the reception, Vanessa's mother approached me, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "So you're the famous Patricia I've heard so much about, the one who nearly destroyed my daughter's career over perfume criticism?" I braced for confrontation, but she laughed warmly. "Honey, if someone had insulted my smell at that age, I might have burned down their whole workplace." Dr. Chen attended as my guest, curious to meet the family I'd spent months discussing in therapy. "You've all done remarkable work," she told me during dinner. "It's rare to see people transform conflict so completely into connection." I watched Marcus and Vanessa dancing, their faces radiant with happiness, and knew she was right. As the evening wound down, Marcus found me clearing plates in the kitchen. "Mom, I need you to know that this day wouldn't have been possible without your willingness to change everything about how you handle relationships." I set down the dishes and hugged him tightly. "Your happiness was worth every uncomfortable conversation." Vanessa joined us, her wedding dress traded for comfortable jeans. "Patricia, I have something for you." She handed me a small wrapped box containing a beautiful vintage perfume bottle. It belonged to my grandmother. She always said the best fragrances tell stories of the women who wear them. The inscription read, "To Patricia, who taught me that strong women can choose grace over grudges." Later that night, I sat alone in my garden, reflecting on the journey from that disastrous lunch to this perfect celebration. I'd learned that power without wisdom was destruction, that influence without empathy was manipulation, and that love without vulnerability was just performance. The hardest lesson had been that protecting relationships sometimes required risking them entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Thank you for fighting for our family even when it meant fighting against yourself. Vanessa and I are grateful every day that you chose growth over pride." I typed back, "Thank you for loving me enough to demand better. That's what real family does." The foundation I'd established with Vanessa proved strong enough to weather normal family disagreements, holiday planning stress, and even pregnancy announcement excitement. We'd learned to disagree without attacking, to misunderstand without assuming malice, and to repair hurt without keeping score. Our relationship had become something neither of us had expected: genuine friendship. 2 years later, when Vanessa called crying because she'd been passed over for a promotion she deserved, I offered comfort instead of strategic advice. When I felt overwhelmed by aging and loneliness, she invited me to cooking classes that became our weekly tradition. We'd built something beautiful from the ashes of our mutual destruction. The smell comment that started everything became family legend, referenced with laughter rather than pain. Marcus would joke that his wife and mother needed a nuclear war to achieve peace, but the work had been worth it. We'd learned that forgiveness wasn't forgetting harm, but choosing to build something better than what had been broken. Standing at my kitchen window one morning, I watched Vanessa push my granddaughter on the swing Marcus had installed. 3 generations of strong women who'd learned that love sometimes required fighting for each other instead of against each other. I'd finally learned to smell like what I'd always wanted to be, someone who chose connection over control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.